The day my sister stood up in that courtroom and pointed her finger at me, I remember thinking, she really believes she's going to win this. She was wearing the navy blazer she always wore when she wanted to look serious. Our aunt was sitting right behind her, nodding along like she'd been coached, and my sister looked at the judge, then at me, and said loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Your Honor, my sister has been mentally unstable since she was a teenager. She cannot be trusted to manage anything of value. She never could." I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I just sat there with my hands folded on the table and let her talk. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the last 14 months building a case that would take her entire story apart, piece by piece, number by number. I'm a licensed forensic accountant. I've spent 8 years reconstructing financial fraud for a living, and my sister had just made the biggest mistake of her life by targeting me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this actually started. My grandmother, Vivian, raised me for the better part of my childhood. My parents divorced when I was 6, and my mother, her daughter, moved 3 states away to restart her life. She took my older sister, Lena, with her. I stayed with my grandmother because, as my mother put it at the time, Grandma is better equipped right now. I was 6 years old. I didn't understand what that meant. I just knew that my mother drove away with Lena in the back seat, and I was standing on my grandmother's front porch in Ohio watching the car disappear. My grandmother never made me feel like the one who'd been left behind. That was the thing about her. She had this way of filling up a room with so much warmth that you forgot to feel sorry for yourself. She taught me how to cook from scratch, how to balance a checkbook before I was 12, how to read a contract before you sign anything. "Paper protects you, sweetheart," she used to say. "Always leave a paper trail." She was a retired bookkeeper, worked for the same manufacturing firm in Columbus for 31 years. She knew numbers the way other people know people, intuitively, completely. When she retired, she had enough saved to live comfortably in the house she'd owned outright since 1987. Nothing extravagant, just solid, careful, honest. I went to college on a partial scholarship and worked nights at a hotel front desk to cover the rest. My grandmother sent me $100 every month in an envelope with a handwritten note. Every single month for 4 years. The notes were always short. Things like, "Proud of you, keep going," or "Called the school. They said you're doing fine," I already knew. Lena and my mother came around for holidays sometimes, usually Thanksgiving, occasionally Christmas. The visits were polite and slightly uncomfortable, like a sweater that fits but itches. Lena and I weren't close. We'd grown up in different households with different values, and it showed. She had expensive taste and a talent for making everything about herself without seeming like she was doing it on purpose. I noticed over the years that she was also very good at charming older people, particularly people with assets. When my grandmother turned 78, her health started to slow down. Nothing sudden, just the gradual narrowing that comes with age. Her knees bothered her. She got tired more easily. She started having trouble with the stairs. I was living in Cincinnati by then, about 90 minutes away, and I drove up most weekends to help out. Groceries, yard maintenance, doctor's appointments. Nothing she asked for. I just did it because she was my grandmother and she'd given me everything. That's when Lena reappeared. I should have paid closer attention to the timing. My grandmother's health started visibly declining in the spring of that year, and by summer, Lena was calling her twice a week. By fall, she was visiting, bringing flowers, taking her to lunch, posting photos on social media with captions like "Love this woman so much," and "Family is everything." My grandmother mentioned it once, almost in passing. "Lena's been coming around more," she said. "It's nice." I smiled and said yes, it was. What I didn't say was that the timing made me uneasy, because I knew my sister, and I knew that Lena didn't do things without a reason. My grandmother passed away in February 2 years ago, peacefully in her own home, which is exactly what she wanted. I was with her. Lena was not. She said she couldn't get a flight in time, though I later found out she hadn't booked one until the morning my grandmother died. The will was read 3 weeks later. My grandmother had worked with an estate attorney named Mr. Dillard, a quiet, precise man she'd trusted for years. She left the house to me. She left her savings to me. She left her personal belongings to be divided as I saw fit, with a few specific items noted for Lena and my mother. Everything was clean, documented, witnessed, notarized. Lena did not take it well. The first call came the same evening. My mother called, then Lena called, and then they called together on speakerphone, which told me they'd already coordinated. The conversation started with hurt feelings and escalated to accusations within about 6 minutes. I was manipulative. I had isolated our grandmother. I had taken advantage of a vulnerable elderly woman. I was patient. I explained that I had been present in my grandmother's life consistently for years, that the will had been prepared by a licensed attorney, that my grandmother was of sound mind and fully capable of making her own decisions. I said all of this calmly. Lena said, "We'll see about that." I didn't sleep much that night. Over the next few months, I started noticing things. Mail was going missing. I found out later that someone had submitted a change of address form in my grandmother's name to Lena's address in Nashville. 3 weeks before my grandmother died, 2 credit card accounts I'd never seen before had been opened in my grandmother's name in the last year of her life. One had a balance of over $11,000. The other had nearly $8,000. Both had Lena listed as an authorized user. I documented everything, quietly, methodically, the way I'd been trained to do. Then came the lawsuit. Lena filed a petition to contest the will, claiming undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. She hired an attorney, a slick, confident man named Mr. Ashworth, who had clearly done this kind of case before. The petition alleged that I had manipulated my grandmother over a period of years, isolated her from her family, and coerced her into leaving me the estate. It also alleged that my grandmother had been suffering from cognitive decline so severe that she lacked the mental capacity to execute a valid will. My mother submitted a supporting declaration. So did my aunt, my mother's younger sister, who I'd seen maybe 4 times in my adult life. The hearing was set for a Tuesday morning in March at the Franklin County Probate Court. I hired my own attorney, a woman named Ms. Okafor, who came recommended by a colleague. She was sharp and no nonsense, and she listened to everything I had to say without interrupting. When I finished laying out what I'd found, the credit card accounts, the address change, the financial records I'd been reconstructing, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You understand you're not just defending a will contest here. The conduct you're describing, the credit cards, the address diversion, that's elder financial abuse. That's potentially criminal." I told her I understood. She asked if I wanted to go on the offensive or stay defensive. I said I wanted the truth to be in that courtroom. The weeks before the hearing, I did what I do for a living. I pulled bank records under subpoena. I traced the credit card transactions, restaurant charges in Nashville, a weekend at a resort in Gatlinburg, clothing, home furnishings, all charged on accounts opened in my grandmother's name. I obtained the IP address logs from the credit card applications and confirmed they had been submitted from a device registered to Lena's home address. I pulled the Medicare records that showed my grandmother's documented cognitive assessments, all within normal range for her age. I obtained a statement from her primary care physician. I obtained statements from 2 of her neighbors who saw her regularly. I obtained the original drafting notes from Mr. Ruth. Dillard's files, which included a recorded phone call, standard practice for contested estates, in which my grandmother clearly and calmly explained her intentions. And I compiled all of it into a binder that was 4 inches thick. The morning of the hearing, I wore a gray blazer and flat shoes, and I arrived 20 minutes early. My attorney was already there. She squeezed my arm when I walked in and said, "You ready?" I told her yes. Lena arrived with Mr. Ashworth and my mother. They sat on the opposite side of the gallery. My mother looked older than I remembered. Lena looked confident, the kind of confident that comes from never having been seriously challenged. She glanced at me once briefly, and I watched her decide in that moment that I was not a threat. That was her mistake. Mr. Ashworth opened by painting a picture of a lonely elderly woman, essentially sequestered, he said, cut off from her family by a controlling granddaughter. He spoke about my grandmother's age, her health challenges, the obvious deterioration of her final years. He used the word vulnerable 7 times, I counted. My mother was called as a witness. She described a grandmother who had become confused and easily influenced. She teared up twice. Mr. Ashworth handed her a tissue. Then he called Lena. Lena was composed on the stand, practiced. She talked about how she had tried to reconnect with her grandmother, how she had sensed something was wrong during her visits, how my grandmother had whispered to her once that she felt pressured. It was a good performance. The judge, a calm, measured man named Judge Whitfield, listened without expression. Then Miss Okafor began her cross-examination. She started with small questions. Dates. Timelines. How often Lena had visited in the 5 years prior to our grandmother's decline. Lena's answers started crisp and got slightly less certain as the pattern became visible. Months at a stretch with no contact, then a sudden surge of attention in the year the estate would become relevant. Then Miss Okafor introduced the credit card records. Mr. Ashworth objected twice. Both objections were overruled. Miss Okafor walked through each account, each transaction, each charge. Lena's answers became shorter. I don't recall. I'd have to check. I was an authorized user, but I didn't. Ms. Okafor asked, calmly, whether Lena had been aware that using a family member's credit account for personal purchases without their knowledge constitutes financial exploitation of an elder under Ohio law. Mr. Ashworth was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor, calls for a legal conclusion. Judge Whitfield held up one hand. He looked at Lena. Then he looked at the binder in front of Ms. Okafor. Counselor, he said slowly, who compiled this documentation? Ms. Okafor said, my client, Your Honor. She prepared the financial analysis herself. The judge looked at me. And your client's profession? She's a licensed forensic accountant, Your Honor. She investigates financial fraud professionally. The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Whitfield leaned forward slightly and looked at Mr. Ashworth. His voice was even, almost conversational. Counselor, he said, do you truly have no idea who you've been opposing in this proceeding? Mr. Ashworth said nothing. His mouth opened slightly. He closed it. I looked at Lena. The confidence was gone. She had gone very still, the way people go still, when something they thought was solid shifts under them, and they realize, all at once, how far they have to fall. My mother, sitting behind her, had both hands pressed flat on the table. The hearing continued for another 2 hours. Miss Okafor presented the physician's statement, the cognitive assessments, Mr. Dillard's recorded call, the neighbor declarations. She presented the IP records linking the credit card applications to Lena's device. She presented the forwarded mail documents. Each piece dropped into the record like a stone. Mr. Ashworth attempted a rebuttal. It was thin. He'd walked in that morning expecting a grieving granddaughter defending a simple inheritance. He had not prepared for a reconstructed forensic paper trail. Judge Whitfield denied the will contest petition in full. He upheld the will as valid and binding. He also noted in his written findings, which I read 3 times when they arrived in the mail, that the financial records presented raised serious questions warranting referral to the appropriate authorities. The referral was made. The investigation is ongoing. I've been told it may be several more months before anything is formally charged, but the detective assigned to the case called me last month to confirm they had what they needed. I drove home from the courthouse alone that day. I stopped at a diner about 20 minutes outside of Columbus, the kind with vinyl booths and coffee that comes in a thick ceramic mug, and I sat there for a long time before I ordered anything. I kept thinking about my grandmother's voice on that recorded call. How clear she was. How certain. She'd told Mr. Dillard, quietly and without any drama, I know exactly what I want. I raised that child. She's earned this. She knew. She always knew. I called Ms. Okafor on the drive home to thank her. She said I'd done most of the work myself. I told her that felt right. My grandmother always said if you want something done honestly, you learn to do it yourself. I haven't spoken to Lena or my mother since the hearing. I don't know if I ever will. There's a version of grief in that which I'm still learning to hold. The grief of people who are still alive but gone to you all the same. The grief of realizing that the family you wanted never quite existed outside of the story you told yourself. But there's something else I carry with me too. Something cleaner. My grandmother spent 31 years keeping meticulous records, teaching herself the language of numbers, building a life no one could take from her. And then, without knowing it, she spent years teaching me the same thing. The last note she sent me was 3 months before she died. I found it tucked in the front pocket of my work bag. She'd slipped it in when I wasn't looking. The last time I visited, I didn't find it until a week after the funeral. It was written on the same kind of note-hock she always used, blue ink, her handwriting a little shakier than it used to be. It said, "You're going to be fine. You always figure it out. Love, Grandma V." She was right. Paper trails don't lie, and neither did she. I keep coming back to that moment in the diner after the hearing, the vinyl booth, the thick ceramic mug, the way the parking lot looked gray and ordinary outside the window. And I think about how undramatic it all felt. Nothing exploded. No one screamed. The truth just landed quietly, the way my grandmother always said it would. People talk about justice like it's a lightning bolt, like one day the sky cracks open and everything gets righted all at once. But that's not what happened in that courtroom. What happened was 14 months of receipts, records, timestamps, and subpoenas. What happened was years of learning before any of this, how to read a document the way other people read faces. The lightning bolt people saw from the outside was actually a very long, very patient accumulation of facts. My grandmother understood that. She spent her whole working life keeping other people's numbers honest, and she passed that understanding to me not as a lecture, but as a way of living. She didn't tell me the world was fair. She told me that careful people leave proof, and careless people leave gaps, and if you're paying attention, you'll find them. She was right about that in ways she couldn't have anticipated. I think about what it took to get to that courtroom. Not just the work, though there was a lot of work, but the decision, over and over, to stay grounded when every instinct said to react. When my sister was on that stand, describing a version of our grandmother I didn't recognize. When my mother submitted a declaration painting me as controlling and opportunistic, every time I wanted to be angry out loud, I made myself be precise instead. That discipline, choosing clarity over reaction, choosing evidence over emotion, is something I had to practice. It didn't come naturally. It came from years of doing work that required it. And I think about character. Not the word itself, which can sound stiff and old-fashioned, but the actual thing. What you do when there's no one watching, when the outcome isn't certain, when the easier path is right there. My grandmother could have spent her retirement doing nothing more than keeping her own books. Instead, she spent it teaching a 6-year-old girl how money works, how paperwork works, how the world works when you pay attention to it. That was a choice she made out of love, yes, but also out of a deep conviction that the people who come after us deserve to be equipped, not sheltered. Lena made different choices, and those choices are now part of a formal record in a detective's case file. I don't feel satisfaction about that exactly. I feel something more like clarity. The kind that comes when a long-running confusion finally resolves, when you understand that the outcome wasn't random, wasn't luck, wasn't even about me specifically. It was just the natural end of two very different ways of moving through the world, finally meeting each other in a room where the truth had to be documented. My grandmother left me a house and a savings account, but the thing she actually left me was this, the understanding that integrity compounds over time, the same way interest does, slowly, quietly, and then when it matters most, all at once.